The sky of the alien world was heavy with strange colors twisting together like rivers of fire and ash. The human explorer, named Evan, stood on the rocky ridge, staring down at the colony spread out below him. He had come here on a routine survey mission, but the alarms that echoed through the air told him something had gone terribly wrong. The ground shook beneath his boots, and the clouds above burned with streaks of light, as if the heavens themselves were tearing apart. The colony was built of tall silver towers and curved walls that shone like crystal in sunlight, but now they trembled and cracked as the disaster unfolded. Entire structures leaned against one another before falling in violent collapse. Families rushed out into the streets shouting in their alien tongue, their voices filled with panic as pieces of the sky seemed to rain down in shards of fire. Evan ran down the ridge, his suit carrying the weight of human engineering, but his heart pounding in simple fear. He had trained for exploration, not rescue, yet he could not watch and stand aside. The aliens were people with lives, families, children, and though they looked different, their faces carried the same fear that humans once carried in burning cities long ago. A deep roar split the earth, and a section of the colony floor opened into a vast canyon. A young alien child stumbled near the edge, her small figure barely visible through the smoke. Her eyes glowed a pale silver color, wide with terror as she cried out. Her mother Mira ran after her, but the distance was too great, the gap too sudden. Evan did not think. He leapt forward through falling debris, pushing his body to the limit. The ground shook again, but he slid across the broken stone, reached out and caught the child just before she slipped into the abyss. The force pulled him down to his knees, and his arms screamed with pain, but he held her close and rolled away from the edge. The child clung to him, trembling, her breath rapid and shallow. Myra reached them moments later. Her long dark cloak was torn, and her hands shook as she pulled her daughter into her arms. She spoke quickly in her alien language, then switched to the rough human tongue she had once studied. Her voice carried both relief and command. Human, you saved my daughter. By our law, you must hear me. Evan, still panting, looked at her confused. He had no thought for laws or customs, only for the child he had carried from death. But the way Mira looked at him was unlike anything he had known. Her eyes carried not only gratitude, but also a weight of tradition. He tried to speak, but she silenced him with a single hand raised to the burning sky. Our law is older than these towers, older than even the stars we follow, she said. Clearly, human, you have saved my daughter. By that act, you have saved me as well. You are now bound to us. Both the words struck Evan harder than the quake beneath his feet. He had expected thanks, maybe a gesture of goodwill, but not a decree that sounded more like a sentence. He glanced around and saw other aliens watching, their faces solemn. They did not question her words. They believed them. They expected him to accept. Evan shook his head, trying to understand. Bound to you, what does that mean? He asked, but his voice was nearly lost in the roar of the collapsing colony. Myra held her daughter close, but her gaze did not waver. It means your life is tied to ours. You are protector, guide, and partner. It cannot be undone. The child looked up at Evan through tears, still clinging to her mother. Yet in her eyes there was trust, a silent belief that this strange human who had caught her would always be there. Mira whispered her name, Lyra, and the sound was soft even against the thunder of the world. Breaking apart, more debris fell around them, and Evan realized this was not the place for answers. He grabbed Mira's arm and pulled her forward. The quake had not stopped, and the air was filled with dust, choking their lungs together. They ran toward the outer ridge of the colony where the ground was more stable. Alien guards shouted for order. Citizens stumbled in lines of panic, but the three of them pushed through. At last they reached a small clearing beyond the broken walls. From there, Evan could see the full scale of the disaster. A reactor at the far edge of the colony had erupted, sending pillars of smoke into the atmosphere. The sky burned with crimson and violet storms, twisting together like scars across the heavens. The colony was dying piece by piece. Myra stood tall, though her cloak was torn and her face streaked with ash. She placed one hand on Lyra's shoulder and the other pointing toward Evan. Her voice carried across the crowd who had followed behind. "This human has saved my daughter. By our law, he has taken both of us under his bond. From this day forward, his fate is joined with ours." Aliens around them murmured, some bowing their heads in respect, others whispering in surprise, but none disagreed. It was clear this was no ordinary declaration. It was something sacred, something absolute. Evan stared at Mira, unable to speak. The child clung to her mother and glanced shyly at him. Her small hand reached out, as if to confirm what had been spoken, though she herself could not understand the weight of tradition. Evan took the hand almost without thinking and felt the fragile warmth of life within it. The disaster still raged around them. Yet in that moment, a different storm began to form inside him. He had come as an explorer, a man of science seeking knowledge of the stars. He had expected danger, maybe even conflict, but never this. A bond not chosen by him, not asked for yet, now carved into the law of an entire people. Mira's gaze softened. For a moment, as she studied his face, "You may not understand now, human, but you will. You did not only save a child today, you changed the path of 3 lives." Sky above cracked with thunder. The colony groaned under the weight of its destruction. And Evan realized that nothing in his life would ever be the same again. The night fell heavy over the broken colony as fires burned in the distance and smoke rose into the dark sky. The surviving people gathered in the central square, their faces lit by the strange glow of shattered crystals that once powered their towers. Evan sat near the edge, still catching his breath, his hands trembling from the chaos of the day. He had thought the danger would pass once the child was safe, but now the weight of Mira's words pressed on him like chains. Mira stood before the council, her figure tall and steady, though her eyes betrayed exhaustion. She held Lyra close against her side while speaking in her people's tongue. The council elders sat upon stone seats carved with symbols of their law. They listened with silent judgment as Mira recounted the events of the rescue. When she finished, one of them, an old figure with pale markings across his skin, turned toward Evan and spoke in rough human words so that he would understand. "Human, the law is clear. A life saved binds the savior to the family. You cannot walk away. This is not custom that can be bent. It is law older than the stars." Evan rose to his feet. His voice was firm, though his heart raced. "I saved her because it was right, not because I wanted to be tied to anything. I cannot accept this bond. I am only here on mission. I cannot belong to your people." The square grew silent as every alien eye fixed upon him. The old elder narrowed his gaze. Mira lowered her head, not in shame, but in recognition of the conflict she had expected. She turned to Evan and spoke softly, yet each word was strong enough to carry across the crowd. "You speak of choice, human, but for us this law is not a chain. It is honor, it is survival. Our people believe that when a life is saved, the threads of fate are rewoven. The one who saves is no longer outside, but within. The bond is sacred and cannot be broken. To deny it would bring exile not only upon us, but upon you as well." Evan clenched his fists. He felt the eyes of Lyra upon him, the innocent gaze of the child who now believed he was her protector. Her small hand gripped the edge of her mother's cloak, and her trembling frame showed. She still remembered the edge of the abyss. He could not bring himself to reject her yet. He could not understand why a simple act of saving a life should carry such endless weight. The elder raised his hand and the murmurs of the crowd stopped. "Human, you may refuse, but know this. If you turn away, you will dishonor the bond, and our people will see you not as savior, but as thief of fate. You will walk these lands as outcast." Evan felt the threat like a stone in his chest. He looked at Mira, who held his gaze without anger, only with steady patience. She seemed to know that his struggle was not with her, but with the law itself. He turned away, unable to answer, and left the square, wandering back to the edge of the colony, where the night winds carried the scent of ash hours. Past before Mira came to him, Lyra slept against her shoulder, wrapped in a cloth that shielded her from the cold. Mira stood silently beside him, watching the broken towers shimmer faintly under the alien moons. At last she spoke. You fear what you do not know, human. But the law is not meant to bind against will. It is meant to protect the one who gave protection. It is meant to create family where there was none. Evan rubbed his hands against his face. His voice was tired. I came here to study your world, not to become part of it. I do not know your ways. I do not know how to carry this. Mira sat beside him, placing her daughter gently on her lap. You already carry it, human, whether you choose it or not. Lyra will remember you as the one who pulled her from the abyss. If you walk away, she will feel abandoned. She will never understand your refusal. For her, the bond already exists. The words struck deeper than any decree from the council. Evan looked at the child sleeping so peacefully, her small breath soft against the night air. He thought of his own childhood, of times he had wished for someone to stand beside him when no one had. He realized then that the bond was not only about law, it was about the heart of a child who had placed her trust entirely in him. Still, he could not accept so easily. The thought of being tied forever to lives not his own filled him with unease. He asked Mira quietly, do you believe this bond is fair? You did not choose me either. Myra's eyes softened. She gazed at her daughter before answering. I did not choose you, but fate did, and I see now that fate is sometimes wiser than choice. You risked your life without thought. That tells me more than words ever could. I do not see this bond as burden. I see it as gift. Evan fell silent. He wanted to argue, but the words did not come. Instead, he watched the moons rise higher in the sky until their silver glow washed over the ruins. Around them, the colony rebuilt slowly, people carrying stones, voices calling orders, fires being quenched. Yet even in their work, many still glanced at him as though waiting for his decision. When dawn broke, the council called again. This time the square was filled with even more people, curious to see the human who stood at the heart of their law. Evan felt the pressure as he walked forward, Mira at his side, Lyra clutching her hand. The elder spoke once more. Human, will you accept the bond, or will you turn from it? Crowd held its breath. Mira looked at him, not pleading but patient. Lyra's eyes shone with innocence and trust. The air was heavy with expectation. Evan's mind whirled with fear and uncertainty. Yet beneath it all he felt a strange stirring, as though something within him already leaned toward them. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, he simply met Mira's gaze, and in that silence the council seemed to understand that the path was not yet chosen, but neither was it. Broken, the elder nodded. You will walk with them until the trial of danger comes. Then your heart will decide. The law will not force your tongue, but fate will force your hand. The square released its breath in murmurs. Evan felt the weight lessen slightly. He had not been forced to vow, but he had been set on a path that would test him in ways he could not yet imagine. As he walked back with Mira and Lyra, he felt the bond pressing at the edges of his heart, a silent question that waited for its answer. Days passed after the disaster, and though the fires were put out, the colony remained scarred towers that once touched the skies now lay in ruins, and the people worked day and night to rebuild. Evan helped where he could, lifting stones, carrying supplies, sharing human tools that made the work easier. The aliens were polite, but distant. Many of them watched him with curiosity and unease, for they knew the law that now bound him, and wondered whether he would accept it or resist. Mira walked often beside him, guiding him through the customs of her people. She spoke softly, explaining their ways, how they believed in threads of fate weaving lives together, how no act was ever without consequence. Her words were calm, but Evan could feel the weight she carried, for she too was waiting for him to decide. Though she never pressed him, she always reminded him through her steady gaze that this bond was not only law, but a promise to a child. Lyra followed him everywhere. Her steps were small but full of energy. She carried fragments of crystal in her hands and asked endless questions about Earth, about stars, about why his eyes were not silver like hers. Evan tried at first to keep distance, but the child's laughter broke through his defenses. She reminded him of a life he had almost forgotten, a time before missions, before duty, when he had been young and curious about everything. He began teaching her human words, showing her simple games from his childhood, and soon her laughter echoed through the colony. Yet even as small bonds grew, tension deepened around them. Some in the colony whispered that the law should not extend to an outsider. Some argued that humans were unpredictable and dangerous, that fate had made a mistake. A group of younger warriors spoke openly against him, saying no alien mother should be bound to one who had not been born of their people. Evan heard these whispers at night when he returned to his quarters, and though he tried to ignore them, the weight of rejection pressed heavy on his chest. One evening, as the sun set in crimson light, Evan stood at the edge of the ridge watching the broken horizon. Mira approached carrying food wrapped in cloth. She sat beside him, offering it without words. He took it, but his hands did not move to eat. She noticed his silence and asked, "What troubles you now, human?" Looked at her, his eyes tired. "You know what they say, I hear it every day. They do not want me here. They do not want this bond. Why should I force myself where I am not welcome?" Mira listened with patience. Then she answered simply, "The bond is not theirs to want or not want. It belongs to us three. Only we can give it meaning. The council will stand by it, and I will honor it as long as I live. But you must find your own reason to accept, not for law, not for them, but for yourself." Her words struck him, but he remained restless. He wanted freedom, but he also felt something stir whenever he looked at Lyra. The child trusted him without question, and that trust was heavier than any law. Mira seemed to understand without asking for more. She only sat quietly beside him until the sky grew dark and the stars appeared. The next morning, the colony woke to whispers of danger. Scouts had returned with news that ships of a rival faction had been seen in nearby space. These were not simple traders, but raiders who preyed upon weak colonies and struck where defenses had fallen. The disaster had left Mira's people vulnerable, and the council feared that the enemy would come soon. The alarm spread quickly, and preparations began. Evan trained with the guards, though they looked at him with suspicion. He had human strength and human tools, but he lacked their style of combat. Mira insisted he join, saying the bond required him to stand with them. He resisted at first, but when Lyra clutched his hand and said simply, "You will protect us, will you not?" he could not refuse. He lifted the alien spear and began to learn the strange moves, though his body ached from every attempt. Nights grew colder as the shadow of war hung over them. In the council chambers, elders argued about defense. Some believed they could bargain with the raiders. Others spoke of fleeing into the wilderness. Mira stood firm. She believed that running would only bring shame and danger, that they must stand and fight. Even as she spoke, she placed a hand on Evan's shoulder, reminding the council that the law had already given them a human protector. The words stirred unease, but also silence. None could deny the truth of her claim. Evan felt the pressure grow. He had not asked for this bond, but now it seemed to demand his life. He feared failing, not for himself, but for the child, whose eyes still looked at him with faith. One evening after training, he sat alone. Lyra came to him carrying a small piece of crystal. Glowing faintly, she pressed it into his hand, saying, "This is for you, so you remember you are not alone." He looked at her small face and felt his chest tighten. For the first time, he wondered if fate had brought him here for more than science. Myra watched from a distance, and though her expression remained calm, her heart carried storms. She had lost faith in the law long ago, believing it too harsh, too binding. But as she saw Evan care for Lyra, without realizing, she felt something stir within her. Perhaps the law had not bound them in chains. Perhaps it had revealed what choice alone would not. As the days passed, tension turned to urgency. The raider ships were sighted in orbit, dark shadows cutting across the stars. The council called the people together, declaring that the time of trial had come. Mira stood with Evan and Lyra at the center. The elders spoke in a voice that carried through the crowd. The law will now show its truth. The human will stand with those he is bound to, and In battle, fate will reveal whether the bond is true. The crowd roared with fear and hope. Evan felt his heart pound. He had tried to deny the bond to push it away, but now it had drawn him into a trial greater than himself. The colony prepared for war, and as he stood beside Myra and Lyra, he realized the choice was no longer about law or freedom. It was about survival and the bond of trust that had already formed, whether he admitted it or not. The night before the battle, the colony was silent. Fires burned low, guards walked the walls. Myra sat with Evan in the shadows, Lyra asleep between them. She whispered, "Fate has brought you here, human, but tomorrow will decide if you remain not as outsider, but as one of us." He did not answer, only looked at the stars above, wondering if they too watched the threads of fate weave lives together. Dawn of battle came with silence at first. The alien moons had faded into pale shadows, and the skies turned heavy with thick clouds. The colony stood tense, its people gathered behind the crystal walls that had been half rebuilt after the disaster. Guards lined the ridges, armed with spears and crystal rifles. Their eyes were fixed upward, for they knew the raiders would descend from the stars. Evan stood among them, his chest rising and falling with sharp breaths. He had trained, but training could not prepare him for what was coming. He looked at Myra, who stood calm, her cloak pulled tight around her, her hand resting on Lyra's shoulder. The child's eyes shone with trust, but also fear. A low hum rolled across the air. The raider ships pierced the clouds, dark and heavy like predators. Their hulls glowed with cruel light, and their weapons glimmered with energy. The colony bells rang the alarm, and cries filled the air. Guards raised their weapons, and the people gathered close. The council gave no speeches. They only nodded to Myra, who stepped forward with her daughter, and the Kuz human who now carried the bond. First blast struck the outer walls, sending shards of crystal into the air. The ground shook as explosions lit the ridges. Evan grabbed Lyra, pulling her back, while Myra shouted orders to the guards. The colony's weapons answered beams of light, cutting through the sky and striking the raider ships. But the enemy was stronger, their vessels swarming down like shadows with fire in their wake. Evan felt the weight of choice pressing on him. He could have fled. He could have stayed hidden among the people. But as Lyra clung to his arm, he knew he could not turn away. He rushed with Myra to the front lines. His human strength and training gave him an edge among the guards. He fired the alien rifle with clumsy precision, but his heart carried the courage that Myra's people recognized. He fought not for law, not for honor, but for the two lives now tied to his own. The battle raged. The enemy broke through sections of the wall, landing with armored soldiers. Their figures were taller, stronger, their armor dark as night. They swept through the colony, striking down defenders with cruel efficiency. Evan met them head on, his body moving before thought. He drove his spear into one soldier, knocking him down, then turned to shield Lyra as another struck. Myra fought with fierce grace, her movements swift as wind, her blade glowing with crystal energy. Together they held the line, but the tide kept pressing amid the chaos. Evan realized the raiders were heading toward the heart of the colony, where the reactor remained damaged from the earlier disaster. If they destroyed it, the colony would fall completely. He shouted to Myra, and she understood at once. They had to stop them before it was too late. They ran through fire and rubble, Evan carrying Lyra, while Myra cut down foes with every strike. The air burned with smoke and the screams of battle, but they pressed forward until the reactor tower loomed before them. There they found the raider commander, a towering figure in black armor, his weapon glowing with cruel energy. He raised his blade toward the reactor as his soldiers cleared the path. Evan stepped forward, his body trembling, yet his spirit burning. He shouted in defiance, a sound that startled even the raiders. Myra joined him, her blade ready. Together, they stood as the final defense between destruction and survival. The commander struck with power that shook the ground. Evan blocked with his spear, though the force sent him crashing back. He rose again, blood running from his arm, but determination in his eyes. Myra struck from the side, her blade carving sparks from the enemy's armor. Yet he did not fall. He roared and swung again, but Evan threw himself in the path, taking the strike on his arm and countering with a desperate thrust. His spear pierced the weak point in the armor, and the commander staggered. Mira followed with a final strike that brought him down. The soldiers faltered at the fall of their leader. The guards of the colony surged forward, taking the advantage. With renewed strength, they pushed the raiders back until the enemy ships began to retreat, fire covering their withdrawal. The skies slowly cleared, the heavy hum fading into distance, leaving behind silence broken only by the cries of victory and grief. Evan fell to his knees, his breath ragged. His arm throbbed with pain, but he still held Lyra close. Mira knelt beside him, placing her hand on his shoulder. Her face was streaked with ash and blood, but her eyes shone with something he had never seen before. It was not only gratitude, it was trust, it was choice. People of the colony gathered around them, voices rising in chants. They did not look at him as an outsider anymore. They saw him as one of their own. The elder stepped forward, his voice carrying across the square. The bond has been tested in fire. It is true. The human stands not as stranger, but as family. Lyra clung to Evan, whispering softly, "You did protect us. I knew you would." His heart stirred with emotions he could not name. He had come to this world as explorer, but now he felt something deeper than mission or duty. He felt belonging, not forced by law, but shaped by battle, by sacrifice, by love for lives that had become part of him. Mira helped him rise. Her gaze lingered on his. She spoke quietly so only he could hear. "You could have walked away, but you did not. That is the bond, not law, not tradition, but choice made in fire." Evan looked back at her, unable to speak, but his silence carried more than words. The storm had passed, but he knew his life was forever changed. The colony began to heal again. Banners rose and voices sang of victory, yet deep within Evan's heart he knew the true trial was not only in battle but in the bond he now carried. A bond that had started with saving a child and grown into saving an entire people. A bond that could never be broken. The days after the battle passed slowly, yet carried the weight of a new beginning. Colony was scarred, but it was alive. The people moved with tired strength, rebuilding walls, gathering the wounded, honoring the fallen. Evan walked among them, his arms still bound with cloth from his wounds, but his steps steady. The eyes that once looked at him with suspicion now carried respect. The whispers that had doubted him were replaced by voices that called him protector, guardian, brother of fate. Lyra never left his side. She followed him through the ruins, showing him the pieces of crystal she found among the rubble. She laughed when he stumbled while learning their words, and her joy filled the air like music that refused to be silenced. Even when night came, she sat beside him by the fire, her small hand resting in his as though afraid that letting go would break the bond she believed in with all her heart. Mira too changed in those days. Her calm strength remained, but her eyes softened when she looked at him. She had once seen the law as duty, heavy and unyielding, but now she understood it as more than command. She had watched him fight, not because the council ordered it, but because his heart had chosen. She had seen him bleed for her people without hesitation. She no longer spoke of law when she looked at him. She spoke only with silence that carried trust. The council called a gathering in the great square. The people assembled, their voices quiet, their faces turned toward the elder, who stood upon the stone platform. The elder raised his staff and spoke so all could hear. "The law has been fulfilled. The bond has been tested by disaster and by battle. The human has stood true, therefore the bond is not only law, it is destiny. He is no longer outsider. He is one of us." The people cheered, their voices rising like thunder. Evan stood beside Mira and Lyra, feeling the sound wash over him. He had never sought such honor, yet here it was given to him freely. Mira stepped forward and placed her hand upon his shoulder, speaking so all could hear, "He is bound to me and to my daughter, but it is not a chain. It is a promise. We accept him not only because the law demands it, but because our hearts demand it." The crowd echoed her words, and in that moment Evan understood he was no longer just a man of earth lost in distant stars. He was part of something larger than himself, something woven by fate, yet chosen by his own hands. He looked down at Lyra, who smiled with pride, and he felt a warmth in his chest stronger than any fear. That night the colony celebrated with lights and songs. Crystals glowed across the square, and music carried through the air. Evan sat with Myra and Lyra. At the heart of the gathering, Lyra danced with other children. Laughing under the starlight, Myra watched her with a smile, then turned to Evan. Her voice was low, meant only for him. You once asked if this bond was fair. I tell you now, it is not about fairness. It is about belonging. You belong here not because law says so, but because you have proven it to yourself. Evan listened, and for the first time he did not feel the weight of chains. Instead, he felt the quiet strength of connection. He answered simply, I came here for knowledge, but I found family. Myra's eyes met his, and for a long moment, no words were needed. As the celebration went on, Evan thought back to the day of the disaster. The trembling earth, the smoke-filled skies, the child at the edge of the abyss. He had not known then that saving one life would change his own so completely. He had not known that the bond he tried to resist would grow into something he could not imagine himself without. Now he saw clearly that the law was never meant to trap. It was meant to reveal what choice alone could not. The following days brought peace, but also responsibility. Evan trained with the guards, teaching them human tactics in return for learning their ways. He worked with the builders, using both human tools and alien crystals to raise stronger walls. Myra guided the council with wisdom and strength, and together they planned for the future. Lyra grew bolder, every day running through the rebuilt streets with laughter that reminded them all of why they had fought. Evan no longer thought of leaving. His ship still rested in the valley, but it felt less like a way home and more like a relic of a past he had already left behind. His home was now here, among the towers and the people, among Myra's steady presence and Lyra's endless laughter. He had been bound by law, but he remained by choice. One evening, as the sun set in golden light, Evan stood on the ridge overlooking the colony. Myra joined him, her cloak flowing in the wind. Lyra ran ahead, chasing the glow of fireflies. Evan looked at the horizon and spoke quietly. When I first came here, I thought I was only a visitor. Now I know I was always meant to stay. Myra's eyes softened. She answered, you did not just save my daughter human, you saved me. You saved us all. The words lingered in the air like a promise. Evan felt peace in his heart. The bond that began with law had grown into something unshakable. It was not duty anymore. It was love. It was belonging. It was family. He reached out his hand, and Lyra came running, taking it with joy. Myra placed her hand upon his as well, and together they stood watching the stars rise above a world that was no longer alien but home. And so the story of the human who saved a child became the story of a man who found a family. The law had spoken, but destiny had answered, and in the quiet of the night under the silver sky, Evan knew that his journey was complete, not because it ended, but because it had truly begun. The end.